Going to go right into my message for today and integrate what I wanted to say as far as what I call my 10 minutes of Torah, which are different ideas that help us understand our tradition. We have new people joining us all the time. So I wanted to cover a few of the basics of what we mean by an inner life approach, a spiritual psychological approach to the study of Torah. So I want to break this down into a few pieces. First of all, whenever we come at the text of the Torah from a non-Orthodox perspective, we always have to remember the text is literature, not journalism, which we are not reading a journalist of account of something happened, although I'm not saying the things that we have in the Torah did not happen, but they're written through the eyes of a great master of literature. Now, you cover this whenever you take a course in the literature of the Bible. Certainly not every part of the Bible or part of the Torah achieves the kind of literary excellence that we see in these past few parshiot. But to help us understand them, we have to say things such as not why did God do something, but more specifically, more accurately, why did the author of the text have this character in the text that we call God acting in a certain way? You see this very well presented, remember, in Jack Miles' book called God, a Biography, where he shows that the depiction of God in the Bible, my last reading, I think I counted 20 different depictions, and they are literary constructions. So Jack Miles shows beyond any doubt that the divine in the Bible is an agent, an actor in the story. But from Jack Mills doesn't say this specifically, but in service of something much more important than the theology of the Bible. So it's a literary construction. God is one of the characters, but not the main character in the Bible, not the main interest in the Bible, which is why I don't care much to do biblical theology, because there are 20 different theologies in the Bible. There are 20 different depictions of God in the Bible. So to whom ought we pay attention? To the human being. So from my perspective, this is the second thing I want to say. It's a book of literature written by different people in different times, many different depictions of God. The main interest is the human being. Therefore, the Bible is a book of philosophic anthropology more than theology. One of the main concerns of the Bible, of the authors of the Bible, is the human condition, what human beings are like and why they are like this. Another way of saying it, this gets to the third point I want to make, is the Bible is interested in what I'll call archetypal psychology. So since it is interested in the human condition, what are we human beings like and why are we like this? The Bible therefore presents characters, actors, as it were, in the different narratives. And because they are literary constructions, they're to present the human condition and the problems inherent in the human condition. Each character stands for something in us. So when you're reading the Bible, one can say, why does God do this? Why did Korach do this? Why did Moses do this? Take a step back for a moment and realize these are literary constructions by an author who, in my opinion, is interested in the human condition. So we could ask in any given story, in any given narrative, for example, how does the way that Moses acts in this story, how is it a representation of some archetype within us? Aaron as an archetype within us, Korach as an archetype within us, and even God as an archetype within us. So it's a literary text, not theological, in my opinion, mostly philosophic, anthropological, focus on archetypal paradigms, which means it's about us, which means in archetypal psychology, in philosophic anthropology, we don't ask what happened then. That would be an historical approach. And again, I'm not saying the Bible is not history, but that's not its main concern. When we study history, we say what happened then. When you study philosophic anthropology, the human condition, you're asking what happens all the time. So again, I'm not against an historical study of the Bible, but I'm much more interested in a philosophic and psychological understanding of the Bible, which is what happened in the text always happens among us human beings. You know, not every character is active at every time, but if you study the text, you can see the depiction of the divine, of Moses, Aaron, Korach, and you can probably see yourself and other people in the story. Now, a last thing I want to say, I'm very interested in the ethical and value-driven aspects of the Bible, and virtually every person who comments on this narrative is interested in the ethics of dispute. Uh, Korach being a counterexample in the ethics of dispute. He confronts Moses in public. He's not really bringing up a substantive issue. He uses sloganeering. He's trying to point out faults without any real evidence of the fault, trying to push Moses back into a corner, and true act of demagoguery. So when we look at from a values perspective, demagoguery is bad. We look from an ethical perspective, this is clearly not an ethical way to conduct dispute. So that's very clear. So if you want to know how not to conduct dispute, don't be like Korach or the rebels at Mount Sinai or those who refuse to go into the land. They are counterexamples. Another way of saying it, they are examples of the pitfalls of the human condition. So don't do that. And then the Talmud give other examples, especially the behavior of the school of Hillel in the Talmud, if you want to know what to do. But that's not my question. Anybody who studies this would agree, yeah, we shouldn't be like Korach. But what they typically mean is those other people shouldn't be like Korach. Nobody will cop to acting like Korach. Now, as I try to understand things rationally, clearly, and factually, in political debate, I mostly see Korach, which is not people who are trying to rationally understand an issue, seeing it from all sides, trying to slowly tease out the truth from engaged, respectful debate. That just doesn't happen in politics. In politics, the behavior of Korach is the accepted model, well accepted, of political disputation. I said last night, it's always bothered me, by the way, that you'll never get to the truth by hearing political disputations because no one cares about the truth. They want to get elected and they want to throw that other bum out of office. Okay, so I'm against this until I read a book by Richard Rorty, Rorty, a great legal scholar. And he said, in talking about the hurly-burly, painful dimension of political discord and dispute, he said, to overcome this, there would have to be some body of school marms, meaning reprimanding everybody that they're not behaving well on the playground. He said, that is not an option. So politics, they get to play rough, they get to throw elbows, but we don't. And that's Rorty's appeal. And my entire career as a rabbi, we don't have to do that because our political parties do it. Whatever political party you identify with, the leaders do that. It's clear they need to win elections. We don't have to engage in it. We can say to ourselves, well, they're activists. They're trying to win. We can be the kind of people that say, let me understand the dispute from all sides, what values are at stake, what the facts are, and why I align with one side or the other. And I don't have to behave like a politician. I can behave like a values-driven, ethical person who's making a considered stand based on the study of the facts and the values at stake. We can be those kinds of people. It's hard. You have to give up your slogans. You have to give up your deepest identity is with some kind of political stand. In fact, I was just talking to someone today, and I'm new here and want to know where I stand on things. And I said, the idea is, where's your center? Where's your merkaz? Are you with this party, this party, this stand? I said, I really don't have any other center aside from my own understanding of truth, values, and rationality. And if I arrive at something that means this group of people won't talk to me, and then I arrive at something where these people don't talk to me, all right, so I don't talk to anybody. But I'd rather think things through rationally with a focus on truth, rationality, ethics, and facts, and be lonely than, as it were, mortgage my integrity to be part of a political group. I've never done it, and I never will do it. Okay, so again, that's what I'll call the ethical, values-driven dimension of this debate. And I'm not saying whatever anybody else should do. I'm simply sharing you what Judaism teaches. Whatever Jewish leaders do, whatever Jewish religious leaders do, our tradition is very clear. We're after truth, we're after rationality, Jewish values, facts-driven discourse, respectful discourse, respect given to all sides as we work toward teasing out the truth of the matter. Those are Jewish values. Now, what's the spiritual psychological? Here's what interests me. You see, I watch, I identify loosely with the Reform movement, Reform ordained and a part of Reform institutions. And you've heard me say many times before, I'm very dissatisfied that Reform rabbis take stands, public stands, not respecting Jewish values and ethics, even though they claim to be interested in Jewish values and ethics. When they say Jewish values and ethics, they typically mean they've lined up on some political dispute on one side or another, typically only one side of a dispute, and then engage in Korach type of disputation, which means attacking, defaming the other side, not engaging in rational discourse, not even showing respect of the other side of an argument. So here's an irony for me. I think Reform Judaism understands itself as being deeply devoted to social ethics, and I think Reform Judaism is, but the manner of discourse is not ethical. It is not rooted in facts, it is not rooted in rationality, and it does not respect the position of the other side. In fact, sometimes when I've asked Reform rabbis, could you please give me a respectful presentation of the other side of the argument, they're actually unable because it's never occurred to them to do that. So I'll call that the ethical side. Now, here's my question. Why aren't people able to be ethical? It's very clear what the ethics are, and it's very clear the lack of ethics in political discourse. I mean, you can point it out against the other side. I typically point it out on all sides. These are educated Jews who know the text at least as well or better than I do. They've studied Korach, they've studied the Talmud, they've studied Hillel, but they on a regular basis violate it. See, that's the spiritual question. Not are people learned, but why they don't have the will to live up to the values that they themselves stand for. There's something that happens in the inner life where people say to me, I know what the right thing to do is, I just can't do it. I hear this all the time. In family disputes, disputes between spouses, parents and children, children and parents, they actually know the ethics of how to engage in discourse with others, what I call processing well with others. Whenever I teach my class on virtue, the wall of virtue, no 4Cs, no bad Jedi. If you're new to this, you'll learn all these terms by heart soon. Everybody, when I present, everybody says, yeah, that's right. That's good. You're really onto something. And I can't do it. I always forget. I put it on my refrigerator. I tell my spouse to do it. And then when it's time to not criticize, not complain, not condemn, not engage in escalating argument, they say, I forget. And my response is, you didn't forget. You didn't train. You don't have the will and skill to do it. So that's what's interesting for me. So what happens to people, and again, this is a spiritual psychological question, who know better, but fail anyway? So we have to go down and look at the spiritual psychological makeup of the human being, which, remember, is one of the main ways that I like to study the Bible, including the ethical, including the value side. There are many ethical lapses in the Bible. When people talk about having the 10 commandments, in the schoolroom, people say, well, what about stoning the child who eats too much? Yeah, it's not so ethical, right? It's very clear there are ethical lapses in the laws of the Bible and the stories of the Bible. We'll put that aside for a minute. I don't think any person who understands the Bible from an ethical, rational perspective can possibly justify laws of the Torah. We bring our own ethical lights to the Bible. I'm talking about things that we do agree with, that we do know are right and wrong, that might agree the Bible might not. Why can't we come up with it? So what I've been sharing is we human beings fall under a kind of moral stress. We fall under a kind of a moral stress. And here's why I've been paraphrasing from M. Scott Peck's book, The Road Less Traveled, that what he says in the book is people aren't willing to engage in legitimate suffering. How do people avoid legitimate suffering? From my perspective, it's allowing oneself to become dysregulated in the realm of the unconscious ego self. So a dysregulated person, an angry person, a resentful person, a guilt-driven person, a shame-driven person, an envy-driven person are oftentimes, I mentioned three things in my Shabbat thought. First of all, they're not seeing reality as it is, including the reality of the human condition. I'll just give you an example. Many years ago, I've mentioned this before. It's such a chilling example where parents came to me and said they were trying to help their child succeed in life, and so they funded their child through school and graduate school. The child decided that he didn't want to be an attorney anymore, so he went through masseuse school. Then it turns out he actually doesn't like touching people. Then he wanted to open up a restaurant. And they shared with me, he's draining our retirement. I said, he's not draining your retirement. You're draining your retirement. They said, what do we do? I said, turn the tap off. Just turn that hose off. I said, how can we do it? They weren't asking how, because it's very easy. No. They said, we can't do that to our child, implying the child does not have the wherewithal to face life. Now, maybe the child doesn't have the wherewithal to face life, and it might have come from parents who kept the hose on the child's entire life, but they actually never had to stand on their own 2 feet. Now the parents are facing very difficult circumstances. So now the question is, and by the way, this happens over and over again. When I counsel parents of adult children where things have gone wrong, I say to them, for everything that you've done for your child, have you taught them wisdom, including the wisdom to suffer well in adverse circumstances and find their own resilience and their own resources to face life and not have parents save them every time they get into trouble? Okay? Now, that's something that starts in childhood, certainly in teenage years. But many people, and here's the awful truth of the matter, they feel sorry for their children. Now, the children ingest this. The children ingest, I'm not capable. I can't stand up to life without my parents intervening on my behalf. Now, when I say this to parents, there's a deep reality that sets in, meaning what I'm saying is true. I said, you tell me the facts and I'll say them back to you. And they get very sad and they grieve and they say, I'm an awful person, I've been an awful parent. I said, you're like so many people, but now's the time to feel grief, to be accountable. You have made mistakes. Now the question is, at this point in your parenting, can you become a parent of wisdom, and can you impart wisdom to your child in that order? You can't parent a child with wisdom if you don't have some wisdom to impart. And the wisdom is not to paralyze your child from being able to achieve their own sense of resilience. I have 3 active cases that I'm working with, which is why I might be so concerned about this, where parents are looking back and they say, I was not a wise parent. And that might be a factor for which the child themselves do not have wisdom. And Scott Peck talks about it. He said, people ingest the wisdom and values of the parent. Doesn't matter what the parents say. Doesn't matter how much the parents provide for the child. There's something called wisdom, and included in wisdom is the ability to suffer legitimately. M. Scott Peck calls it problem solving, sometimes from very difficult problems, without getting angry, without despairing, without becoming nihilistic, without resenting, without envy, without all the kinds of dysregulation, where a person, you get a hold of yourself, you take a deep breath, you accept the reality of the situation, you decide to become accountable, you're willing to suffer sadness and grief, and figure out what's the small step I take next. Now, from M. Scott Peck's perspective, therefore, a deep part of wisdom, and I agree that I concur with this entirely, a deep part of wisdom is sadness, grief, and suffering. In fact, M. Scott Peck says in The Road Less Traveled, and it's filled with wisdom that we all know, but it's great when someone says it for you. Wisdom has to be earned through suffering. One thing I learned that, when we go on the path from disappointment to sadness to grief, we enter into sometimes great misery, but we know that's the price we pay for wisdom. So I'm going to say as clearly as I can. There's no wisdom without misery. There's no wisdom without grief. If you refuse to be miserable, be accountable, accept reality, don't blame, self-regulate, you'll never suffer legitimately, to put in M. Scott Peck's and Carl Jung's language, and you'll never come out the other end as a wiser person. Now, from this perspective, you see, I go at Korach. Clearly, Korach does not know the ethics of disputation. And, every commentator talks about the ethics of disputation. The question I'm suggesting to you in what I'll call the spiritual psychological study of the Bible is, why couldn't Korach do it? What happened in his inner life that propelled him toward what I'll call unethical disputation? So let's go into Korach a little bit deeply, as well as the other incidents. Actually, let me cover a few of them because we do have beginners here, and I wanted to show you how this question of not only the question of what are the values, what are the ethics, which are important questions, but why can't people live up to ethics that seem so clear to us? So we'll discuss three circumstances. Again, this is going to be well-worn road for many of you, but it's always well to review. Let's go back to Mount Sinai just very briefly. They arrive at Mount Sinai from Egypt. Moses goes up to the mountain. Again, this is literature, not journalism. He's up there for 40 days. The people are left at the bottom of the mountain. When Moses comes down with the tablets, the people are cavorting with the molten calf, more or less reverting to an old-time religion, some kind of orgiastic dancing, going back to some kind of Dionysian rituals. Moses throws the tablets down, the covenant is broken, right? And then if we look at this as, remember, literature, not journalism, archetypal psychology, not chronology, philosophic anthropology, not writing in a way to condemn, but as a writing to present the human condition. What happened to those people? Okay? We have to look at ourselves very deeply. And I remember, if I get this right, a movie called Days of Wine and Roses, if I'm not mistaken, with Jack Lemmon, where he and his wife are alcoholics. If I remember correctly. If not, I know I saw the movie. I might not have the actors and the name right. But if you remember the movie, they're trying to become sober. And the Jack Lemmon character, he's a kind of, I think, like a Wall Street executive. He sees that he's a drunk. He sees that his wife is a drunk. He sees their friends, and he decides to go sober, if I'm getting the story right. And you see the grim, resolute determination, the profound suffering of anybody who tries to go sober. Because one reason people do abuse drugs and alcohol is they're not willing to suffer legitimately. Every time they feel bad, they engage in the addiction. They just want to feel better. So why does a person engage in addictive behavior? Because they feel bad. And instead of suffering legitimately, which means work through the misery of your life gone wrong without engaging in addictive substances, all the way from heroin to food addictions or emotional addictions, there's a grim resoluteness. You kind of white knuckle it and say, whatever I'm going to do, I'm not going to do that. And there's a deep knowledge at stake. I think every person who's been able to face misery directly knows the misery will end if I don't resort to addictive behavior. I'm going to work through it. I'm going to come out on the other side with wisdom. If I engage in addictive behavior, my growth as a human being stops right here. Any addictive behavior you engage in stops spiritual, moral, and personal growth. So again, a person who is committed to personal transformation is willing to suffer, willing to go through misery, because on the other side of misery is wisdom. So this being said, what was the misery of at Mount Sinai? The misery was, again, now remember, this is interpretation. The Bible is very coy. It doesn't give us a cliff notes on what the answers are, but you try to look at the story. Moses on Mount Sinai, coming down with the text, and they abandoned the covenant. So I think to myself, looking at the Days of Wine and Roses, if we can understand going into a 12-step program like accepting the revelation from Mount Sinai, which is filled with don't do that. Thou shalt not. Thou shalt not engage in addictive behavior. Don't do it. Stop right now. Go sober. Okay, what do people do? They say, I can't stand this. I can't stand the idea that I have to go sober. So I'd rather bolt from rehab than go through the misery of becoming sober, because becoming sober is miserable. until you come out the other side. So when I look at the story, I think of people that realize they're going to be asked to live lives of nobility and dignity and restraint and moral character. They say to themselves, we won't be able to do it. We won't be able to do it. I'd rather break the covenant now and get out before I face failure, because facing failure is miserable. Now, a person of some kind of moral dignity goes through failure, failure after failure after failure. It's better to fail than to abandon the program, right? So when I look at all the things that I've tried to do and I failed, I say to myself, okay, I failed. I didn't keep my schedule. I didn't get the thing done. All right. But that doesn't mean it wasn't worthwhile, because something is worthwhile. You spend time on it. You accept failure. You accept misery because it's worthwhile. If it's worthwhile, you will encounter misery. And I thought to myself, well, if I really love what I want to do, then I will experience misery doing it. And I'm not going to stop just because I became miserable, because miserable simply means I haven't engaged in enough spiritual growth, and I can only engage in spiritual growth if I'm willing to be miserable. Okay, so misery is a path to spiritual growth, which means you don't want to change anybody else. You don't want to get angry at people, resent people, guilt, shame. You just want to face reality, be accountable, emotionally regulate yourself, go through sadness, grief, misery, and come out the other side in wisdom. Well, they couldn't do that. See, I think that's what the molten calf story is about. Not that they wanted to become, engage in idolatry. They engaged in idolatry as a way not to be accountable. Then we go to the sin of the spies. Okay, they arrive at the borders of Canaan. They go scout out the land. They come back with a very dismal report. They didn't follow instructions and report. They gave an evaluation that we can't do it. My question, what's the failure about? And again, I think it is a sense of we're not up to the task. If we go into Canaan and we fail, we'll be ashamed of ourselves. And they say, and again, in a statement that almost really beggars the imagination, if it weren't a great work of literature, they say, we'd rather go back to Egypt than risk failure of going into Canaan. They say, we wish we have died in the desert than die in war. So you say to yourself, well, if you're going to die, why die in the desert as opposed to dying in war? Because dying in war might mean failure, means you didn't defeat the enemy. So dying in war might include shame. Just dying in the desert, okay, you ran out of food and water, you perished in the desert. There's no shame in that. But there is shame in cowardice. There is shame in running away from the battle. I mean, there's no shame in getting, as I've written before, there's no shame in getting shot in the chest as you're attacking. There is shame in getting shot in the back as you're running away. So many people are more afraid of shame and failure than death, which means people would rather run away and get killed than attack and get killed. And this is something well documented in studies of valor, courage, and so forth. So what happened at the borders of Canaan? A complete failure of nerve. And as I spoke about that, what is the antidote to lack of courage, which is duty? And it sounds a little bit grandiose when I say this, but I mean it with utter sincerity. When you're doing your duty, your feelings don't matter because it's your duty. So people say, well, what if you're afraid? And what if you don't want to face up to it? I said, well, is it your duty? Because if it's your duty, you'll suffer every negative emotion that your inner life can come up with because it's your duty. And therefore, it's your duty to deal with any negative emotions. Now, I think what happens to people is they say, well, it's only my duty if it doesn't make me feel really bad. If doing my duty makes me feel really bad, then I won't do my duty. I'll give you a real life example. And this is not a one-off. I've had this counseling session with many times of a person who was in a relationship, a young person in a relationship for 5 or 6 years, and wanted to break it up, but they felt guilty. And I said, let's say they're 31 now. I said, when did you know that you were going to marry this person? And they said to me, 3 years in, but I stayed for 5. And I said, and you didn't break off? Why? I didn't want to hurt their feelings. I said, okay, do you realize that you had a duty to tell them you weren't going to marry them so they could go back out and meet people and get married because they were relying on you. They said, yeah, you're right. I should have, but I didn't want to hurt their feelings because if I would have hurt their feelings, I would have felt guilty. Now think about this. A person wants to avoid feelings of guilt. So they string another person on and steal, I'm saying it certainly in a rhetorical way, steal 2 years of their life to avoid guilt, right? It's breathtaking for me. I mean, if someone did it to my kid, it says, yeah, I'm going to string you along and steal 2 years of your life and let you know a couple of years too late that I never was going to marry you to begin with. I say, well, that's wrong. But why do people do those wrong things? They don't want to feel guilt. And not feeling guilt was more important than doing their duty of being honest with another human being. Now, I could give you many, many examples where people didn't do their duty because they were avoiding an unpleasant feeling. Okay, and I'll assign that to the story of the spies. And if you read this along with me, I'm not saying my interpretation is right, but you can see the depths of the human experience that gets opened up with these stories. And then we have this week's story. What's with Korach? Remember, they just got the news they're not going into Canaan. They're going to live out 40 years in the desert. And here's again, this is my interpretation of a great piece of literature. Why would they come up with this preposterous attack on Moses using demagoguery? What happened inside of them? Well, again, here's my imaginative reconstruction. They know they're guilty. They know that they have been rebelling and rebelling and rebelling over the food. Again, at Mount Sinai, over the lack of meat. They didn't like the manna, one thing after another, until God finally says something like, no more chances. Now, those are very chilling words. When a person says, you've run out of chances, it's over now. Remember back in last week's Torah portion, once they were told you're going to stay in the Sinai desert, and die here, they said, "Oh, give us one more chance." And they tried to run up, and attack from the south. They got beaten down at Har Hormah. You'll see this at the end of Shalach, last week's Torah portion. Well, there's an example where God said, "I said no more chances." And you defied me. You thought I was going to give you one more chance. Actually, when I said no more chance, it was actually no more chances. You are stuck here and you're going to die here. Now, hopefully your children will learn from this and they'll be able to go into Canaan. And if they don't, then they're going to die here. They didn't want to hear this. So now they're going to experience their death in the desert. So you have a couple of choices. You can say, well, I regret my behavior. I'm accountable. I did it to myself. I'm miserable when I look at my past behavior. And what I'm going to do now is suffer with dignity. I'm not going to make it worse. And I'm not going to attack Moses and Aaron as if it's their fault. It's my fault. I want to be accountable. I want to deal with reality. I will accept the misery of looking back and realizing I did bad stuff and now I'm suffering the consequences. And I will suffer the consequences with dignity. This is my imagination of what a dignified, legitimate suffering would be like. So instead they say, nah, it's their fault. Moses and Aaron, it's your fault because you've arrogated the priesthood to yourself. And you say to yourself, what does that have to do with anything? What problem is that going to solve if they take the priesthood away from Moses? It doesn't actually solve any problem except help them avoid reality and accountability and in my mind, their own sense of the misery of looking back and realize they've made terrible mistakes. That's human to make mistakes. It's human to have regret. Okay. And we can use those moments, no matter where we are in life, to gain nobility and wisdom. But we can't gain nobility and wisdom if we're not willing to do our duty, including duties of facing reality and being accountable. Now, so all this is a way to share with you a couple of things. Remember, the Bible is literature, not journalism. It's constructed by a literary genius, inspired by God, not inspired by God, somewhere in the spectrum. That really doesn't interest me. The text is not mostly concerned about God. God is certainly present in the Bible. The Bible is mostly concerned with philosophic anthropology, the human condition. The characters in any dramatic scene in the Bible are archetypal psychological, which means they stand in a Jungian sense for aspects of ourselves. Again, so you look at any narrative in the Bible, you can say, I can see myself, I can see someone else. which means what happened in this chapter in the Bible didn't happen then. It happens all the time, which is what we mean by philosophic anthropology and archetypal psychology, and I'll say spiritual psychology in general. So my goal today was to use this story and the other narratives to remind us what we mean by an inner life, spiritual, psychological understanding of the Bible, including philosophic anthropology, the nature of the human condition, including archetypal psychology, how our inner life is populated with archetypes that get animated at one time or another in our lives.